Oh, shoot. Oh, okay. What are we doing? Yes, must email the class. Hey, Meg, how's it going? You like some... Hey, Sarah. Sorry, I just have to take some notes right now on this tea I'm drinking. I just woke up. It's my first night of 8 hours of sleep in a very long time. Sophisticated, stringency. Yeah, it's floral, but there's a hint of licorice in there. It's delicious. Okay. Good morning, Enza. Look, it's my cat duo, Meg and Enza. Good morning, Yona. It's going well. I'm very tired, though, even though I sleep so much. Sarah, that might be part of the problem. I think there's a sleeping sweet spot of around 7 to 8 hours, and if you sleep less than that or more than that, paradoxically, you will also become more tired. So I would highly recommend, just chilling out, but not chilling out so hard. Yeah, you gotta hit the sweet spot. If you sleep too much, then you become a zombie. That's no good either. All right. So we have 5 people in the chat. I got some last minute submissions this morning. So I'm just gonna read those while we wait for everybody. Okay. Yona in particular and Diman. So you just read these for a second. Yeah, Sarah, I get the feeling you don't sleep too much during the school year. While I do this, why don't you guys do this too, right? So let's give ourselves, let's really start in 4 minutes. But in the meantime, take some time to read your classmates' responses. Okay. what I'm going to be doing. Oh, Yona, very spicy. Oh my God, I gotta make a new Google Doc right now. Because you just made me think of something I had never thought about before. Ah, that is so good. Yummy. Good morning, Dimon. All right, cool. So, I've got some cool things to think about. I'm gonna brew a last cup of tea and then we can start. Okay. In the meantime, let me ask how you guys are doing, and we can start off with a couple questions, right? If you guys still have any questions on Empedocles and like what he was saying and why what he's saying is significant, or any part of an argument, whether it's his or Parmenides, that you still don't understand, way to go. It just means the longer you struggle with something, the more fulfilling your intellectual journey becomes. I promise. So if you guys still have questions, think about it, right? If there was ever a fact that you understood right away, then it's not very fulfilling to learn it, is it? Um, so yeah, the longer you struggle with something, the better it'll stick with you. And I think, yeah, it's good to struggle with some things. So if you guys have any more questions, that's cool. In the meantime, I'm just gonna pour my tea. I think Kyle is writing a response to your response right now. That's why he just left you hanging at that, Sarah. Okay, so let me start with the first submission, who is Luca. Okay, I think Luca's asleep right now. It's totally cool. All right, so let's go over the assignment, right? Especially for those of us who didn't turn it in, who were content thinking about it, which is cool, right? Because that's all philosophy really is. We're just thinking. So Parmenides presents two arguments, right? A, that is not statements are illogical, right? And the argument goes as follows. Like premise one, I state X does not exist. Or when I say there is no X. Premise 2 would be, when I say X does not exist or there is no X, I am in fact stating X does exist. This is Parmenides Principle. That principle itself deserves a whole other argument, maybe like argument C, right? And then my conclusion would be, I have just stated that X does and doesn't exist simultaneously, therefore implying a contradiction. Okay. Proof by contradiction is probably one of my favorite ways to prove things, whether it's in philosophy or in math, any classical logic. Sometimes it's so much easier to prove that the negative can't be true rather than the positive being true. Okay. B, all things are imperishable. Change, therefore, saying that change is illogical. This follows from argument A, right? Premise 1 would be, if something changes, it will either come from or enter a state of non-being. We cannot think of what is not. This is argument A. And then, therefore, change itself is unthinkable. Okay? So Empedocles attacks argument B by saying that non-being is used in the existential sense in premise 1, right? Like if Luca's example would be, if I go from a red apple to a green apple, how Parmenides thinks of that change is not an object really changing, but a red apple ceasing to exist and then a green apple taking its place, right? So whether you think about the red apple at some point will stop existing, or the green apple, because the red apple turns green, the green apple had a period of time where it didn't exist. And from we already know that we can't think of things that don't exist, right? It's illogical in an existential sense. But Empedocles says, in the second sense, when we say we cannot think of what is not, we're actually, when we're thinking about change, right, we're actually thinking about that in the predicative sense. So because premise 1 and premise 2 use is not in two different senses, the argument is no longer logical. All right. However, it still is logical in the case where the sense of the word to be, or like is not, is used in the existential case in both cases. It would also be logically valid if it was both predicative, right? But the problem is it's almost impossible to interpret premise 1 and argument B. If something changes, it will either come from or enter a state of non-being as predicative, right? That's not really, we can't really use that in the predicative sense. So premise 1 is always going to be existential, and premise 2 could be either existential or predicative, all right? If it's predicative, then it's a change that is allowed, and if it's existential, since the argument is valid because I have two uses of the existential form of is not, then it can be, it's valid, and we can say change is not allowed. And what Empedocles says is there is a case where it's existential, and that would be for the 4 classical elements, right? Like those are the things that don't really change. They always exist, they always will exist, matter is conserved, mass is conserved, yada, yada, yada. And it's their forms and permutations that are different senses of the word to be in the predicative sense, right? So if I look at a green apple and a red apple, the green apple doesn't exist in the existential sense. A red apple doesn't exist in the existential sense. They are merely predicative adjectives for how my 4 classical elements are arranged together. In that sense, you could also argue that the birth and life and death of a human being are viewed as change that are predicative and not existential. This gets into the point of saying human beings don't really exist. They are merely predicate adjectives for all the carbon and the phosphorus and oxygen, and what other elements? Silicon and iron and stuff in our body. Like the way that they are arranged in the current state is just a predicative version of an arrangement of these elements. When I asked you, do you agree or disagree with Empedocles' statement? I'm not asking you if you agreed that if the world was broken up into four basic elements. I think it's pretty widely accepted at this point that it's not true, right? That we, as naturalists, have come to accept the standard model as the closest thing to uh, empirically supported the empirically supported model that we have, right? And that divides the world into almost like 20 different fundamental particles, and it's not really like fire, water, earth, and it's not like Avatar. Um, so that's not what I was asking you, right? What I was really asking you, and I think a couple of you interpreted the question that way. I was asking you more about the second part, and I think I worded the question badly, right? So, can the birth, life, and death of a human being be viewed as change that is predicative and non-existential? Because Parmenides would say no. But then how would Parmenides reconcile the birth and death of a human being? If a human being really does go out of existence, well, how's he really going to talk about that? It's a little complicated. Okay. Is that making is that clarifying a couple things? Does it make it more confusing? Because we have to make a distinction between like onto physical existence and I would say conceptual. And I'm sorry, my mind's working a little slow this morning. All right. If you want to think of so Parmenides Principle, right? PP basically rests on a fundamental epistemological um, epistemological okay, epistemological premise, right? That objects only exist as concepts and as observables. Like that, I think is a pretty radical thing, right? So this ring, for example, right? Like, if an alien like visited Earth, right, and the alien like looks at this, the alien would think of this as just like a lump of silver, right? But as human beings, we know to call this a ring. So the only thing that makes it a ring is not its own existence, right? But the thing that makes it a ring is us, our consciousness, our subjective application of identity, right? And then we have physical existence, right? So like when I'm born, I would say, it's okay tomorrow, Grandmaster, so good to see you. Hashtag river, right? And that I think is a real big problem, right? Because when we're talking about Empedocles' argument of people not really existing, right? And they are simply predicative adjective states of like I mean, the basic elements, like whether it's four or like whether it is what we know as today, right? This, I think, is where you run into kind of a struggle between like what we want to call physical existence and the dichotomy between that and like a conceptual identity. So when I'm born, I would say, yeah, I didn't exist and now I physically exist. But what about me is so physical, right? Like the elements that made me up have always existed. So what is it about me that exists? Like compared to like before I was born or like after I die? Like what is it exactly that is existing, that has come into existence? I think looking at it this way, Empedocles' argument is pretty sound. It's very hard to attack. It's mainly hard to attack because if I look at physical existence versus conceptual existence, the conceptual is very subjective. So it's hard to talk about conceptual existence in an objective manner or in an absolute manner that's supposed to describe like what really is, right? Because it is so subjective. That's one way to attack conceptual identity. But the other way to attack physical identity or physical existence, like fire, water, earth, and air, is to say, like, well, when we describe the universe and when we observe the universe, are we not conceptualizing like these four basic blocks in themselves, right? And calling them like fire, water, air, and earth? Like, yeah. Okay. Let's get into a really interesting discussion between Yona and Luca. I'm going to read Luca's first, her response to the first prompt, right? I disagree with Empedocles for two reasons. First, there is not an effective theoretical distinction between a predicative and existential change. I disagree with that, but that's like a whole other thing. If a red apple turns green, there is no distinction between it changing states to green and a red apple ending existence and a green apple starting existence. That means a distinction between predicative and existential necessitates the existence of a soul-like quality every single individual object in the universe has. Second, the materialistic conception of this through elements fails to account for how individual objects can be composed of many objects. If I, for example, exist as a singular entity, otherwise, the conception of I would be unintelligible, as I would be an assemblage of parts and not an individual whole. In that way, to say all objects are simply modes of a single distinct element disregards both how I as a physical thing am an assemblage of many elements, not just one, and how I exist as an individual outside of the elements that compose me. Okay, so Luca hits a really interesting idea here in that she refutates the existential predicative distinction that Empedocles uses to dismantle Parmenides' argument. Ironically, even when doing so, Luca doesn't really defend Parmenides by attacking Empedocles' attack on Parmenides. Rather, she seems to be struggling with taking the position that predicative and existential change are different. Right? To which we have to say, right? How would we respond to Luca here? Yona has a very interesting response that touches upon something completely different than what I'm about to tell you right now. Wait, technically, since we can't confirm the existence of a soul, Well, I mean, Kyle, neither can we really confirm the existence of earth, water, air, or fire, right? Like there are certain assumptions that you're going to have to make when you're creating a theory of like what is and what's like fundamental about the universe. There's very little we can prove until we set some baseline or like ground line assumptions, right? We can't disregard it as a factor when we try to deem something as existent or existing or extant. Yeah, sure. So let's dissect Luca's argument here, right? If I, for example, so Luca says if a red apple turns green, there is no distinction between it changing states from green to red and an actual green apple stopping existing and a red apple coming into existence. And I think the way Empedocles presents his argument distinction between those two changes, right? Because what Empedocles is saying is that the only things that exist are the four basic elements. Anything else is a concept. Anything else is an idea. So he rejects the notion of a green apple existing, ceasing existing, and a red apple existing and ceasing existing, because he argues that the red and green apples don't exist, period, because they are merely concepts. Whereas whereas the elements that make up the apple physically exist, and the way they are arranged causes us as observers to conceptualize them as different entities in our heads, like to give them different identities, but they don't really exist, right? Because how you group the apples, how you group the elements is quite arbitrary. But let's go into Yona. All right. This is so cool. Okay. Yona starts, and I'm going to start where he tags Luca. Luca Musk says that there is no distinction between an apple changing states to green and the red apple ending existence and a green apple starting existence. But as an apple goes from red to green, it likely first goes to light red, then pink, and then greenish pink. It is constantly making slight changes in color. But under your definition, every time it is changing, it is losing its existence and gaining another one. If the apple is constantly changing color, then at what points would you say that a new apple is being created? Saying that every change can be represented by an existential start and end of an object would imply that its existence is infinitesimally small. Do you guys see where Yona is going with this? Like, what's the problem here? If I identify change as like ceasing existence and creation of new existence, but I also conceptualize change as something that's continuous, like, what's the problem? Right, write that in that chat. Like, what does that mean for existence itself? And where I'm going with this is the duration of existence. Like, how long do certain things exist for in this model? Okay. Hey, attune, 0 seconds, exactly, right? So from my apple at 1 second when it's green to a couple of days later where it's red, I would say there are an infinite number of apples between the green one and the red one because it's constantly changing at every single point in time. Which means that each version of the apple existed for 0 seconds because they're an infinite number. Like, how do I define, if the whole process took 3 days, I don't care how many seconds that is, but you divide that by an infinite amount of numbers or versions, and you get that each version lasted 0 seconds. So that's a huge problem with this model, right? That's not to say Luca's model is wrong. That means Luca's model is inconsistent with a continuous linear timeline. So what Luca's model is consistent with, though, however, is a discrete pixelated timeline. Whereas almost like movies or like stopwatches where I have like, oh, it's like 0.01 seconds, 0.02 seconds, if I have like, if I treat life as a flip book and the universe as a flip book where everything has a frame and like, oh, I exist at this point and this point and this point, instead of a continuous stream of time, that's something that Luca's model basically necessitates pixelated time and not continuous time, which is wild, right? Exactly. So Luca's model also rejects the notion of a continuous consciousness. Luca's model, in this way, says the world resets every 0.00, like whatever unit of time you're using, right? For movies, it's 24 frames per second. So in a Hollywood movie, every 24ths of a second, the world is destroyed and it's created anew, and there's like a new version of it, right? Under Luca's model, like instead of a 24ths of a second, it's a much smaller time frame, but the concept is the same, right? It's broken down, it's eliminated, it's destroyed, and then a new universe is created, just like that, with the same amount of mass as before, and blah, 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 blah. And it gives the illusion of continuity. Why does Luca's model necessitate that? Because as Yona pointed out, it's if we try to reconcile Luca's model with like a continuous model, then we get that certain things exist for a zero amount of time, which is so bleh, okay? Now, if you really do want to try and and what is my argument when I say Luca's model necessitates this and really imply? It implies that there's only two options, right? That there's a continuous time frame and then a pixelated like flip book movie frame time frame, right? And I said because it's irreconcilable with the continuous one, I have to accept the other one. That's a premise that I'm using, right? So if you can think of a third option, then my argument is now also defunct. What are we doing here? We're arguing, we're constructing arguments, and we're critiquing arguments. The goal here is not really to really look at how the universe really works, right? It's how to construct an argument. Did Parmenides believe in a continuous timeline? I think so, because he's talking about predicative change and not existential. If you want to accept a continuous time frame, then then it's gonna be, is a continuous time frame consistent with Parmenides' arguments? Yes, I would say so. It's actually accepting that time is continuous is another way of proving that is not statements are illogical. Rather than his basic proof of going for a contradiction, right? We can use continuous timelines to show that if things exist and then don't exist, and things also change, and I look at change as going from non-existence to existence, then I could prove that things exist only for milliseconds. I mean, for a zero amount of time, and then therefore saying that that's also logical, right? I never thought about it that way until you brought it up. So thank you, Yona. Yona, we all learn things from each other. Let's go over the second bit. All right, what Democritus and Leucippus say. All right, so I think that problem is not as complicated as some are making it out to be. When I say, so first of all, let's look at what they're really saying. They reject Empedocles' assertion that there are four basic elements. They reject Anaximenes' assertion that it's all water, right? They reject Anaximander's and Anaxagoras' association that it's all air, right? What they're really saying is that the world, and it's probably the closest thing to what we have, right? That the world is made up of like matter and stuff that isn't, emptiness, right? The void. And that's exactly how we think of the universe today. Like we have a vacuum, we have space, and we have things that can occupy that space, right? Now, I think most physicists would argue that space exists, but in a completely different way from how matter exists, because space exists so that it can be filled up with matter. Matter exists in that we define them with each other, right? Space exists as like something that can be filled by matter, and matter exists in that it fills up space, and they exist together in that way. Are there limits to space? What do you mean by that, Sarah? Oh, did I even heat my water? 1 second. I did. I hear it now. Okay. Is it continuous or infinite? Sarah, we don't know. Our best guess is that the universe. Oh. Do you know what the problem with an infinite universe is? It means that conservation of energy and matter are principles that only exist on a local level and not global. Because if the universe is infinite, then what does that mean to have an infinite amount of mass and an infinite amount of energy? It's really weird. But I don't want to talk about like whether the universe is continuous or discontinuous, if it's finite or infinite. With the goal of discovering like what the universe really is, because I think that's impossible, right? What we're really trying to do here is we're trying to learn how to make arguments, arguing for continuous or discontinuous or infinite, finite. Like I want you to come up with your own argument. There's no right answer, right? It's about coming up with your own argument for either position or attacking a position that you disagree with and finding faults in the logic. It was never about actually finding out what is, even though that is a noble quest in itself. Okay, so they have divided the universe into matter and the void. Cool. And they define the void as like what is not. And they say emphatically that it exists. just as much as what is. It's a huge slap in the face to Parmenides. But how did they get away with it? It's very simple, right? When Parmenides states, I state there is no X, that's existential. When he says, by thinking there's no X, there is an X, that's also existential. So the contradiction exists only because you're using there is no X in both the existential case. The clever turn Leucippus and Democritus make here is when they identify the void, they say it exists in the existential sense. The void is not something that doesn't exist. Even though it is defined by what it is not, it still exists. So they're not saying there is no void, right? They're not saying like, oh, it's like what is. So they're not defining void as like matter and not matter. That's not it. Because remember, we can't talk about not matter, right? So they don't define void as not matter. They define, it's literally two separate things, matter and the void. And the void is not only in the predicative sense, because it is space, but it is space that is not full. So that's an adjective. So the void isn't it's not an existential void. It's a predicative void. So that's how they can get away with saying the world is divided into matter and like what is not matter, right? Which is void, empty space, right? So the other way they can define that is like the world is divided into full space and empty space. Yeah. So which which premise are they altering? One, if I state X does not exist. Sure. When I identify the void, I'm actually saying it doesn't exist in the predicative sense. So I can get away with it, right? Because now I've just called it predicative. Sarah and Yona chose to change premise 2. I think both work, actually. You just apply the predicative sense to one of them, and it's fine. Yeah. Oh, you guys are so distracting to me, right? This morning I've just been oversteeping my tea because you guys are so fun to talk to. I get distracted. I'm only supposed to steep this for 1 minute and 30 seconds every time, every steeping. But I think the last one was 3 minutes. This one was 2 minutes. Why is that important, Mr. So? Because it gets more bitter the longer you do it. That was my Regents class. Thank you. No, I don't want you looking at the talk while I speak or while we speak, because then you won't be focusing on the important stuff, right? Yeah, so Sarah, it's okay. You can you can alter either premise to invalidate the claim. Yeah. So it is possible to talk about what is not, as long as what you talk about is in the predicative sense. Like I can still talk about something that doesn't have a quality. It's still true. I can't think about something that doesn't exist. I can't do that. But when I talk about the void, I'm not talking about what doesn't exist. I'm talking about something that doesn't have X quality. And that's a completely different thing. Okay. So we've talked about this, right? Let's move on forward. Oh yeah, so I've already given you the calendar, right? I think for what we're doing now. By Friday. Oh, I said I'll briefly introduce Plato. Oh yeah, yeah, and I gotta do this before 10:30, which is my AP stream. Yikes. Okay. Okay. So here's some necessary context about Plato. Okay. Woo. Woo. Okay. So okay. So it is weird to jump into Plato without really talking about Socrates. I don't know if I can squeeze all this in because the reading does talk about Socrates. Hold up. Okay. Okay. Here we go. So we have to remember that the train of thinking, or I would say the legacy of Greek philosophy, um, goes from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, and then by extension from Aristotle to Alexander the Great. But we don't really think about Alexander the Great as a philosopher in the same vein, right? He's a lot more. Um, and Socrates is very famous for. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna link you one of my favorite videos on YouTube about from art history, from back when I taught AP art history. Death of Socrates. It is a neoclassical painting from the 18th century, and it's beautiful. And there's so many layers to this. But anyways, so a basic story is that Socrates formed like a school of Socratic thought where you always ask why. Like, why do you think this? Why do you think this? Why is this true? What's your reasoning? Blah, blah, blah. And that what naturally kind of followed, and he had a lot of students. Most of them are young, including Plato. And the a principal consequence of like what happened there was that people started questioning the state. And then Socrates was accused by the Athenian state for corrupting the youth. And he was sentenced to die, to go into exile or to die. And he chose to die because he was a really proud guy. And so he drank a hemlock and died. And most of what we know from Socrates is from Plato, his student. And the excerpt you're about to read is called the Apology. Okay. So, or the Apologies of Socrates. And this is a defense against the charges of like corrupting the youth and blah blah blah. So this basically like this is like how Plato presents. This is Plato presenting how Socrates defended himself in trial. Okay, so that's what you're about to read. Now if we talk about what Plato is like most famous for and stuff, like he's probably most famous for like his theory of forms and like his idea of like idealism. When we talk about Platonic Ideal, and that comes from like his allegory of the cave, right? So when people talk about Platonic friendship or like Platonic idealism or Platonic realism, they're frequently misinterpreted, right? What Plato believed that there is like an ideal, perfect version of everything, and that's what the adjective Platonic is meant to describe. It's like the perfect or the ideal or the version of something in the way that it's meant to be. And what the allegory of the cave kind of illustrates is like a person's discovery of these ideal forms. That is like all I can probably give you right now without like basically going into a full-blown lecture about like who Plato was and like all of his readings. In addition to like his theory of forms and like his belief that there is like an ideal version of everything, he's also a very noted political theorist and a political philosopher. Yeah, because if there is an ideal version of something, there's also an ideal or a perfect way to govern as well. So it's a very broad-reaching philosophy. Yeah, but read that. That is so cool. And a related painting would be the School of Athens. Uh, but who has the best video explaining School of Athens? I don't know, actually, because I always just taught it without a video when it was time to go over that painting. Basically, the cool thing about the School of Athens is that it has Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, right? And Plato points up because that's like him referencing his ideal forms, right? Like things exist in the heavens and like things on earth are like unideal and stuff. But it's whatever. We can talk about this later. Yeah, the School of Athens is the painting that is that's there, right? Because it's basically almost all of the classical ancient thinkers in antiquity presented, and the Renaissance was seen as the Italian Renaissance was seen as like a rediscovery and a rebirth of a lot of the ideas that were discovered or explored in that time, like 2,000 years ago, right? Cool. What do you mean that is what Miss Ash showed us? What did she show you? Oh no, it's 10:30. I gotta go. Bye. Oh, that. Yeah, I don't really like the Khan Academy video. That's why I never showed it when I taught the class. I think it misses a couple details that are pretty cool. But we'll go over that later. Maybe, yeah, I think I'd love to have a little lesson on neoclassics, on both the Italian Renaissance and the neoclassical period. in Western Europe and how it relates to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Maybe we could do that by the time this is over. I think that would be pretty cool. Anyways, I got to start my AP stream. Meg, I'll see you for the reason stream where we're going to go over those answers for interference. Okay, cool. All right, cool. Bye.